One of the most misunderstood aspects of avoidant psychology is this idea that avoidants are unaffected by distance. People often assume that because avoidants appear calm, detached, or emotionally self-contained, they do not react deeply when someone pulls away. But psychologically, that is not true at all. In many cases, avoidants are highly reactive internally. They are simply trained to suppress, intellectualize, or disconnect from what they feel. And this is why your silence became so powerful. Not because silence is a game, not because silence is manipulation, but because for the first time, the emotional dynamic stopped functioning in the way they expected it to. Most avoidants unconsciously rely on predictability. They may resist closeness, fear emotional dependence, or create distance when intimacy becomes too real, but they still expect emotional access to remain available. They often assume that if they withdraw, the other person will compensate by pursuing harder. They expect messages, explanations, emotional reactions, attempts to fix the connection. Even when they push someone away, part of them still expects reassurance that the bond remains intact. That Tion creates a hidden sense of control, not always malicious control. Sometimes it is entirely unconscious. But psychologically, it allows the avoidant to manage intimacy from a safe distance. They can disconnect emotionally while still feeling secure that the other person has not truly left. This is one of the central contradictions within avoidant attachment. They fear emotional engulfment, but they also fear complete abandonment. So they create relationships where they can maintain distance while still keeping emotional certainty nearby. But your silence interrupted that pattern completely. When you stopped chasing, stopped over-explaining, stopped trying to prove your worth, something shifted inside them. Suddenly, they were no longer managing the emotional rhythm of the relationship. The usual structure disappeared, and what replaced it was uncertainty. Uncertainty is deeply uncomfortable for avoidants because it forces emotional confrontation. As long as they can predict your reactions, they can stay emotionally defended. But silence removes emotional data. It creates space. It creates ambiguity. And ambiguity forces introspection. Now they begin wondering things they never drew. They allowed themselves to wonder before. Are they really done? Why aren't they reacting? How did they become so calm? Why do I suddenly feel disconnected from someone I thought would always stay? And this is where many avoidants experience emotional destabilization, even if they never show it outwardly. Because your silence quietly communicated something far more powerful than anger ever could. You no longer need their validation to survive emotionally. That realization can feel humiliating to someone who unconsciously believed the emotional attachment would always remain available. Not because they wanted to hurt you, but because they never fully imagined losing access to you. They assumed the emotional door would stay open indefinitely. Your silence challenged that assumption. What makes this even more psychologically significant is that silence forces avoidance into the very emotional state they spend most of their lives avoiding. Self-reflection. Normally, avoidants escape discomfort through distraction, emotional suppression, work, independence, logic, or distancing behaviors. But when someone they expected to emotionally pursue them suddenly becomes still, and unavailable, those defenses stop working as effectively. Now there is no emotional noise to focus on except their own thoughts, and that can become unbearable, because beneath avoidance is often unresolved shame. Shame about vulnerability, shame about emotional dependency, shame about not knowing how to sustain closeness without feeling trapped or exposed. Your silence becomes a mirror reflecting all of it back to them. This is why many avoidants become irritated after you detach. People mistake that irritation for indifference, but often it is emotional frustration. Your silence removed the emotional structure that allowed them to stay psychologically comfortable. They are no longer reacting to your pursuit, they are reacting to your absence. And absence is powerful because it forces reality to become visible. For the first time, they begin experiencing what your presence was actually providing. Emotional safety, consistency, validation, warmth, patience, understanding. These things often go unnoticed when constantly available. But once they disappear, the nervous system notices immediately. Human beings rarely understand the full value of emotional stability until, it is gone. And this is the deeper truth most people miss. Your silence humbled them because it revealed that love is not possession, attention is not permanence, And emotional access is not guaranteed forever. The moment you stopped fighting to keep the connection alive alone, they were forced to confront something they never prepared for, the possibility that your life could continue without them in it. And for an avoidant personality, that realization can echo far louder than any argument ever could. Sometimes the silence that changes people the most is the silence that finally teaches them they are no longer being chased. What makes this situation even more psychologically complex is that the avoidant is not only dealing with the loss of emotional control, they are also confronting embarrassment. And embarrassment is one of the most difficult emotions for avoidant personalities to process because it threatens the image they carefully maintain about themselves and others. Avoidants often move through relationships believing they understand emotional dynamics better than everyone around them. They pride themselves on independence, emotional restraint, and self-protection. Many convince themselves that they are the rational one, the composed one, the person least likely to become emotionally affected. This internal identity helps them feel safe. It creates psychological distance between themselves and vulnerability. But your silence disrupted that identity in a very personal way. Because at some point, many avoidants quietly misjudged your emotional value, not necessarily because they thought you were weak, but because they became accustomed to your consistency. Human beings have a dangerous tendency to normalize what is constantly available. The calls, the understanding, the patience, the emotional labor, the willingness to repair conflict over time, these things stop feeling extraordinary and start feeling permanent. And once something feels permanent, people unconsciously stop fearing its loss. This is especially true for avoidants. They often assume emotionally loyal people will remain emotionally loyal no matter how much distance is created. In their mind, the connection becomes psychologically stable enough to survive neglect, inconsistency, or withdrawal. They believe they can step back emotionally without truly risking the relationship, because the other person has already proven their attachment repeatedly. And that is where the misjudgment begins. They mistake your love for endless availability. They mistake your patience for emotional dependence. They mistake your understanding for weakness. But when you finally become silent, not emotionally reactive, not begging for clarity, not trying to force communication, the entire perception changes. Suddenly, the person they thought would always stay begins to feel unreachable. And psychologically, that creates embarrassment, because now they must confront the possibility that they misunderstood you completely. They thought you would collapse without closure. You found peace without explanation. They thought silence would pull you toward them. Instead, silence pulled you back toward yourself. They thought they had more time. Now they are confronted with the terrifying possibility that they wasted it. This realization often happens quietly. Avoidants rarely announce it openly because doing so would require vulnerability and accountability at the same time, two things that deeply activate their defenses. Instead, the embarrassment appears indirectly. You may, notice mood shifts, subtle attempts to reconnect, passive observation from a distance, unexpected emotional reactions, or even irritation toward you. But underneath those reactions is a wounded realization. They underestimated someone they should have valued more carefully. And this is where human psychology becomes deeply philosophical. People often believe power comes from intensity, from emotional arguments, dramatic confrontations, or proving how much someone hurt you. But real emotional power often comes from restraint, from composure, from the quiet dignity of someone who refuses to abandon themselves in order to keep another person comfortable. Your silence communicated self-respect, and self-respect changes the entire psychological equation. Because when someone sees that you can walk away without destroying yourself, they are forced to reevaluate your worth entirely. Suddenly, you are no longer viewed through the lens of emotional availability. You become someone with boundaries, inner stability, and emotional independence. That realization can be deeply unsettling for avoidants because it removes the unconscious imbalance they relied upon. Now they begin replaying memories differently. They remember how patient you were during their emotional withdrawal. They remember the conversations they dismissed too quickly. They remember the loyalty they treated casually because they assumed it would always exist. And regret becomes sharper when hindsight reveals emotional truth. This is why avoidants often feel embarrassment long after the relationship dynamic changes. not simply because they lost someone, but because they recognize often too late that they mishandled someone emotionally mature enough to love them deeply without losing themselves. That realization is humbling, especially for people who built their emotional identity around self-protection and control. And perhaps the most painful part for them is realizing that your silence was not cruelty, it was clarity. You stopped trying to convince someone to see your value because you finally understood something important. People who truly value you do not need endless demonstrations of your worth. At a certain point, emotional maturity means accepting that over-explaining your value to someone who continuously overlooks it becomes a form of self-betrayal. So while the avoidant may, Drew, appear distant externally, internally they are often wrestling with a profound psychological contradiction. They miss the emotional safety you provided, but they are embarrassed that they only recognized its importance once it disappeared, and that is the tragedy of emotional avoidance. Sometimes people do not understand the depth of what they had until the silence becomes permanent enough to hear their own regret. What confuses many people in these dynamics is the anger. After the distance, after the silence, after you finally stop chasing, there is often a strange emotional shift in the avoidant. Instead of softening immediately, they may become colder, more defensive, more irritated. Sometimes they appear almost resentful toward the very person who simply stepped away peacefully. And on the surface, that reaction makes no sense. If they wanted distance, why are they upset that you gave it to them? If they needed space, why does your silence provoke them emotionally? If they detached first, why do they suddenly seem emotionally unsettled when you stop reaching? The answer lies in understanding what avoidant anger actually represents. Most avoidants are not comfortable with Drew, direct vulnerability. From early on, many learned to associate emotional dependence with danger, disappointment, loss of control, or emotional overwhelm. So instead of processing painful emotions openly, they often convert those emotions into something psychologically easier to manage: irritation, emotional numbness, criticism, withdrawal, or defensiveness. Anger becomes a protective emotion, not because they are evil or manipulative, but because anger creates distance. Vulnerability creates exposure. And for avoidant personalities, exposure can feel psychologically threatening. This is why your silence affects them so deeply, because silence removes distraction. It removes emotional bargaining. It removes the dynamic that allowed them to stay emotionally defended while still maintaining indirect connection. Suddenly, there is nothing left to react against except themselves, and that is profoundly uncomfortable. When you were chasing clarity, seeking reassurance, or trying to repair the relationship, their attention remained focused outward. Your emotional energy gave them something to manage, something to avoid themselves through. But once you became still, the emotional spot, light turned inward. Now they are left alone with feelings they spent months, sometimes years, suppressing: regret, shame, fear, loss, attachment, longing. These emotions do not disappear simply because someone avoids them. In fact, avoided emotions often intensify beneath the surface because they remain unresolved. The avoidant may appear detached externally while internally experiencing emotional conflict they do not know how to regulate. And this is where anger enters the picture, because psychologically, it is easier to feel frustrated with you than to confront the possibility that they mishandled someone who genuinely cared about them. It is easier to become irritated by your silence than to admit your silence revealed their emotional dependence. It is easier to criticize your withdrawal than to acknowledge that your absence now feels emotionally heavy. Many avoidants unconsciously expect emotional pursuit to continue indefinitely. Even if they reject closeness, they still rely on the emotional certainty that someone is there. Your silence interrupted that certainty, and once certainty disappears, anxiety begins surfacing underneath the avoidance. But instead of addressing that anxiety directly, many avoidants externalize it as frustration. This is why you may notice contradictory behavior. They pull away but watch you from a distance. They avoid conversation but react emotionally when you seem happy without them. They appear indifferent yet become unsettled when they realize you are truly moving forward. What they are experiencing is not simple anger. It is emotional disorientation, because your silence forced them into a reality they were not emotionally prepared for. The realization that they no longer control access to your energy. And for someone whose attachment style is built around emotional self-protection, losing that psychological control can feel destabilizing. There is also another layer to this that most people overlook. Your silence acts as a mirror. And mirrors are uncomfortable when someone has spent years avoiding self-examination. The avoidant begins seeing their own behavior reflected back through your absence. They remember the moments they withdrew instead of communicating, the affection they withheld, the conversations they avoided, the emotional inconsistency they justified while expecting your understanding return. Your silence quietly exposes all of it without needing to accuse them of anything. And that is what makes it so psychologically powerful, because deep down most people already know when they mishandled someone. The human conscience does not disappear simply because emotions are suppressed. It waits. It lingers beneath distraction and emotional avoidance. And eventually, silence gives it room to speak. This is why avoidants sometimes become emotionally reactive long after a relationship dynamic changes. The delayed emotional processing catches up to them. The emotions they postponed begin surfacing all at once, but without the emotional tools necessary to process them calmly. So the frustration leaks outward. But here is the important truth. Their anger is not proof that your silence was wrong. Often, it is proof that your silence forced emotional reality into the open. For the first time, they are being confronted with consequences instead of comfort, with absence instead of reassurance, with uncertainty instead of emotional access, and uncertainty destabilizes anyone who relied on emotional distance as a coping mechanism. This is why emotionally grounded silence, can become transformational. Not because it punishes the avoidant, but because it removes the illusion that connection can survive indefinitely without emotional responsibility. At some point, every human being must confront the difference between having access to someone's love and actually valuing it while it is still there. And for many avoidants, that realization arrives disguised as anger long before they recognize it as grief. And perhaps the most important part of this entire dynamic is what happened after the silence, because silence alone is not what truly changes the psychological balance. Anyone can become quiet temporarily. Anyone can disappear for a few days out of anger, exhaustion, or emotional strategy. But what truly unsettles the avoidant is when silence becomes transformation, when your energy changes, when your identity changes, when your emotional dependence on the outcome begins dissolving. That is the moment the entire dynamic shifts permanently. Most avoidants unconsciously expect time and distance to weaken emotional attachment on your side while preserving emotional control on theirs. They assume that eventually you will miss them loudly enough to return. Open the connection. And in many cases, this assumption comes from experience. They have often seen people return repeatedly, overlook emotional inconsistency, or continue offering love despite emotional neglect. So at first, your silence may not fully register. They may assume you are waiting, healing temporarily, trying to make a point. They believe the emotional structure remains intact beneath the surface. But then something unexpected happens. You begin growing beyond the relationship itself, not performatively, not to prove a point, but genuinely. Your emotional focus shifts inward. You stop measuring your worth through their attention. You stop obsessing over their emotional availability. You begin rebuilding your peace, your routines, your confidence, your sense of identity outside the connection. And without realizing it, you become emotionally unavailable to the very dynamic that once consumed you. This is what truly humbles the avoidant, because now they are no longer watching someone emotionally attached to them. They are watching someone emotionally free from them, and those are two completely different realities. Psychologically, this creates a delayed recognition. Nishan of value. Human beings often struggle to appreciate stability while they are surrounded by it. Emotional consistency becomes invisible when it is always accessible. But once that consistency is removed, once the person who offered understanding, patience, warmth, and emotional loyalty begins moving forward, the nervous system suddenly recognizes the emotional absence, and the avoidant begins seeing you differently. Not as someone waiting emotionally in the background, but as someone capable of building a meaningful life without them. That realization creates a very specific type of fear, the fear of permanent loss. This is important because avoidants often suppress emotional urgency during the relationship itself. When intimacy becomes too close, they create distance to regulate themselves emotionally. But distance can create an illusion of safety. As long as they believe reconnection remains possible, they do not fully confront the consequences of disconnection. Your growth destroys that illusion, because growth communicates finality in a way silence alone cannot. When they see your energy becoming calmer, your boundaries becoming stronger, your emotional dependence fading, they begin understanding something they avoided confronting earlier. Your absence may no longer